Don't ask to go up the tower. Don't touch the brass rope hanging behind chapel door. Don't mimic the bell's chime, even in play. And I remember the time I clapped twice at dinner, and my mother flinched so hard she knocked over her wine glass, and the stain on the tablecloth was never washed out, just folded away like it hadn't happened. And afterward she told me, with that same smile that didn't reach her eyes, that some sound were not meant for our ears, and I nodded as I always did, and never clapped again. And every Sunday we'd walk past the bell tower after church, and someone, usually grandfather, would pause and remove his hat, not with reverence but with warning, like the tower deserved not worship but wariness. And sometimes I thought I heard something inside, not a bell's call, but something more primal, a metallic hum just beneath the silence, and I'd feel it in my stomach before I heard it in my ears, and I'd press my hand to my belly and tell no one, and the tower remained just that, a relic, a mystery, a structure that loomed in every family story and yet featured in none directly, always adjacent to grief, never its source. And as I grew older, I learned to accept its presence the way one accepts a scar on a face they love. You stop seeing it, you stop questioning it, until one day someone points and you remember, and it comes back all at once. And I remember the games we played as children, hide and seek, that always ended too early if someone strayed. Too close to the tower's door, tag that veered sharply away from its base, and how the ground beneath it was always damp, even in drought, and no one ever commented on it. And I remember how my cousin Thomas used to whisper that the bell had rung once, long before we were born, and that something was taken that day. And I remember how the adults would say things like, "We don't speak of the tower," and "Some stories are too heavy for small hearts," and how we accepted that silence because we were taught that to question it was disloyalty, and loyalty in this family was currency. And then there was a day the stonemason came, years later, when I was maybe 11, to inspect the tower supports, and afterward he went white as paper and left without billing, and no one ever spoke of it again. But the next morning the chapel door was locked and grandfather's voice was unusually hoarse, and I began to notice the absences, not of people, but of moments, conversations that stopped when I entered, pages torn from books and study, names not listed in family records, photographs with faces scraped just slightly out of focus. And the older I got, the more I understood that this wasn't a house built on wealth or bloodlines, but on careful omission, and the tower was its monument. And sometimes at night, when the manor creaked with age and the wind made the windows weep, I'd hear vibration in the walls, subtle but unmistakable, like the pull of breath before a scream, and I would pull the covers over my head and whisper the family's bedtime mantra. Sleep quiet, wake proud, and never climb. And that mantra stayed with me long after I left, tucked in the corners of my thoughts like lint you can never quite shake loose. And I thought I had forgotten the tower, thought I had outgrown the house and its silent heart. But standing beneath it now, adult and fractured, I understand it was never about forgetting, it was about keeping it buried. And now that I've returned, now that the old stone looms once more above me, I see clearly that the tower did not sleep all those years. It watched and it waited, and it held its breath for someone foolish or desperate enough to break the silence. And I, God help me, might be the first one ready to listen. The portrait gallery had always been the coldest room in the manor, not because of draft or shadow, but because it held the most eyes, eyes that seemed to breathe as you passed them, eyes that tracked not out of malice, but from a place deeper, a place where memory fermented into obligation. And I hadn't stepped foot inside since the week of my grandfather's funeral, when the floor still smelled of polished oak, and everyone's grief was performed like theater, soft words and rigid postures, and someone, I don't remember who, had drawn the curtains and said, "Let the ancestors see us mourn," as if the painted faces lining those walls could grant absolution if they were offered enough polite pain. And now, returning, as an adult with years of distance and suspicion under my belt, I stepped into that room and was immediately gripped by a familiarity I hated, that itchy, crawling sensation of being recognized by things that shouldn't know your name. And I stood just inside the threshold, letting my eyes adjust, and felt the air go still, like the room inhaled and refused to exhale. And the first painting I approached was of a woman I had forgotten I remembered. Her hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked carved, her lips a straight line, her hands folded in her lap with fingers long and bony, and beneath her was a brass plaque that read, "Ginevra Vexley, 1864 to 1912. And I knew that name, not from story but from whispers, from the way older relatives would mutter in passing, and then pretend they'd said something else. And I leaned closer and realized her eyes, painted in the traditional deep brown of all Vexleys, were off subtly, the irises just slightly asymmetrical, like the artist hadn't wanted to paint her directly. And I move on to the next, a man with sharp shoulders and a rifle propped casually against his leg. His gaze turned just enough to seem indifferent, and I saw that his plaque had been scratched, the name illegible, and I paused, frowned, ran my finger over it, and felt grooves, deliberate and angry, and further down the row. There were more portraits where the names were either missing, altered, or clearly re-engraved in a different style, and something about that rattled me. Because the Vexleys prided themselves on legacy, on order, and here was a fracture, a scar left visible because to remove the painting entirely would raise questions, and I started to catalog them, naming those I could: Theodoric, Estelle, the twins who died in infancy, and noting those I could not, until I reached the final stretch, the wall of the silenced, as I began to call in my mind, where 5 portraits stood in a row, each with matching frames, each subject young, no, older than 20, and each will look not a stillness but a shock of just buried fear beneath practiced expression. And the one in the center, God, the one in the center was her, Aurelia, my cousin, my almost sister, who vanished when I was 14, gone with no funeral, no obituary, just a tight-lipped family meeting and a reassigning of her bedroom to storage. And there she was, immortalized, lips pressed into something almost a plea, her left eye fraction larger than the right, like she hadn't sat still or the artist had captured something too real. And her plaque simply read AV, as if even 3 syllables were too much acknowledgement. And I reached out, fingertips grazing the frame, and the wood was warm, warmer than it should have been, and I pulled back instinctively, heart thudding, and it hit me all at once. These weren't portraits made to honor. They were containment, visual graves, a gallery of names and faces held in stillness, so no one would ask where the bodies were. And I stepped back, dizzy, eyes scanning the room with new awareness, seeing how many plaques it smudges, how many names have been shortened to initials. And I thought of the tower, its silence, its height, and wonder if it was less a beacon and more a lid, pressing down on a family that had too many stories and not enough endings. And I whispered Aurelia's name, just once, and the light in the room shifted, subtly, a cloud moving outside, or perhaps nothing at all. But the room felt smaller, denser, and I turned and left without looking back. But the eyes followed, and I understood then that I had not come here to remember. I had come here to retrieve, and the tower was not the only structure meant to hold the past, and maybe, just maybe, it was time one of us learned how to listen to the silence painted into every corner of this cursed house. Dinner at the Vexley Manor was never about food, though the dishes were exquisite, plated with precision that bordered on surgical, with silver forks aligned so neatly they could have passed inspection by a jeweler. It was about order, about the performance of unity under scrutiny. And from the time I was old enough to sit at the long oak table, I understood instinctively that noise was a kind of crime, that the clinking of cutlery or the scrape of a chair drew eyes, and not the soft kind, but eyes that held judgment like a weight pressing behind the forehead. And every dinner began the same, with silence, an unbroken 5-minute ritual before the first bite, during which no one prayed, no one spoke, no one moved, except for grandfather, who would clear his throat at the end, not loudly, just enough to shift the room from stillness into motion. And that sound was our chime, our substitute for what the bell tower refused to do. And as a child, I thought it was strange, theatrical even. But as I grew older, I saw it for what it was: control, a mechanism that replaced spontaneity with structure. And over the years, I noticed how certain topics were never raised, how laughter was permitted only in half measures, and how each conversation skirted too closely to memory before veering hard into banal, whether charity events, livestock auctions, renovations. And I remember one night, years ago, when my cousin Lionel asked why the bell tower had a rope inside if no one ever rang it, and the entire table fell so quiet you could hear the candle wax drip, and grandmother smiled with teeth too bright and said, "Because some sound belonged to history, darling," and no one corrected her, though the tension was so thick I felt it wrap around my throat like a scarf. And Lionel was sent to bed early that night, his dessert untouched, and I never saw him at the table again, though they claimed he went to a boarding school in Switzerland. And when I asked later which one, my mother simply said, "He'll write when he can." And he never did. And so dinners continued night after night, year after year, with chairs that stayed full until they didn't, with faces that vanished from, portraits and memory in equal measure, and still no one spoke of the bell, not during wine, not over dessert, not even when thunder struck so close to the house that the windows trembled and the tower looked for a moment like it might crack. And I remember the night grandfather died, the way no one cried, not even my mother, how the servants laid out the best linens, and the family doctor spoke in circles, and the bell did not toll, not once, though the tradition in town was to ring once for each decade of life, and he had lived nearly 9. And when I asked why we hadn't sounded it, and Evangeline leaned close and whispered, "The dead know their silence." And that phrase stuck with me, wormed into my mind until I began to wonder if silence was less a family trait and more contagion, something inherited by breath and blood. And now, sitting alone at that same table, my fingers tracing the grooves worn into the wood, I felt the absence of those old rituals like a phantom limb, and the stillness press against me with the weight of memory. And I saw them all again. Grandmother's stiff smile, Uncle Harris's half blink before swallowing each mouthful like a stone, Aurelia's fingers tapping her napkin in secret rhythm, Lionel's eyes darting toward the window, as if he could see the tower from his place. And I realized that the bell had been present all along, not in sound, but in the restraint it demanded, the fear encoded in our bodies. And it wasn't just a tower, it was a metronome for suppression, and now I knew. The reason it had never rung was because it already did, every night, inside us, calibrated to our silences, and I stood slowly, the chair legs echoing sharp against the tile, and whispered, "Why didn't you ever scream?" And the air didn't answer, but the chandelier above me flickered just once, and I knew that somewhere in this house, the silence had heard me, and something, whatever still listened from behind the stone, had begun to stir. The tower door was never meant to open, not because it lacked a key or hinge, but because it was, in every sense that mattered, not a door at all, but a seal, a final punctuation mark placed at the end of the sentence no one was allowed to reread. And yet there I was, standing before it with the old brass ring clutched in my hand, the one I found inside the false panel of my grandfather's desk beneath a hidden ledger labeled structural accounts, West Wing and Bell Room, and the key didn't just fit, it clicked with the precision of a clock winding back time, and as I turned it, slowly, every muscle in my back taut with the weight of what I might find, the lock grown open like a throat clearing after decades of silence, and I pushed the heavy wooden door and felt it resist me, not mechanically, but with something almost sentient, like the wood itself had grown used to being forgotten, and the air that spilled out was dry, dust-laced, and cold, not the cold of stone, but of paper, the kind of air that carries the smell of mildew and secrets. And the first thing I saw was not the bell, but a stairwell spiraling upward into shadow, and I climbed it without thinking, each step creaking not under my weight, but under the strain of memory returning. And when I reached the landing, I expected open space, a vast chamber with rope and clapper, but what I found instead was a storage room, meticulously organized, every shelf stacked with black ledgers, some dating back to the late 1800s, their covers cracked, spines flaking, all of them labeled with initials and dates and columns upon columns of handwritten entries. And I pulled one at random and scanned it, heart thudding louder with every line. Payments to tradesmen for discreet labor, fees. To distant institutions for behavioral relocation. A staggering entry labeled August 1921. Silencing compensation approved, and my blood went cold, because that was the same month one of the portraits in the gallery had been quietly removed and replaced with a still life, and I rifled faster now, fingers dirtying with soot and ink, and found dozens more. Child S, removed from roster, Aurelia V adjustments made per directive, BT reassigned to secondary rotation, non-local. And what terrified me most was not the content, but the clarity. There was no emotion, no panic, no attempt to disguise the language beyond bland administrative euphemism, and I realized then that the bell tower had never been silenced by accident or disrepair. It had been deliberately repurposed as a ledger room, a mausoleum of numbers and codes and broken narratives too costly to bury in soil, and I dropped the book, fingers trembling, and stepped further into the space where the light filtered through. A single slitted window high above, and in that dimness I saw a crate, newer than the rest, marked Vexley, archive redacted, and inside, wrapped in yellowing linen, were school records, faded Polaroids, and half a dozen envelopes addressed to family members whose names have been scrubbed from all official histories. And one of them bore my name, my full name, middle included, in handwriting I hadn't seen since childhood, my mother's, and the note inside simply read, "If you found this, the chime is yours to choose." And I stood there, the paper fluttering in my hand, the weight of generations pressing down on my lungs, and I looked up toward the ceiling, where I knew the bell chamber sat just one level higher, and I realized I wasn't just holding a history. I was standing in the middle of a conspiracy so vast and deliberate that the family had transformed an entire architectural feature into a vault for its sins. And as I turned to leave, to breathe again, the door slammed shut. Behind me, not by wind, not by hand, but by the gravity of truth unearthed, and I whispered, not to anyone, but to the tower itself, "Why did you wait for me?" And somewhere above, faint and hollow, a single rope swayed in the darkness, and the silence felt tighter now, not oppressive, but anticipatory, like something beneath it all had been waiting, patiently, for someone to finally listen. I didn't leave the tower that night, not because I was trapped, but because something in me knew that. Leaving now, with only a few pieces of this sprawling ledger unraveled, would be a betrayal, not just to those who had been silenced, but to the version of myself who had sat at this family's endless table and swallowed silence as if it were communion. And so I lit the old oil lamp I found tucked beside a crate of cracked ink bottles, and I began to read one page at a time through the ledgers that lined the shelves like funeral scrolls. And with every new entry, the pattern began to emerge. Not like a revelation, but like mold blooming in the corners of a house you thought was clean. The same handful of initials recurring across decades, children assigned a tier number beside their names, sometimes noted as viable, sometimes excess, and once, horrifyingly unclaimed, and the same handwriting, flowing, precise, annotated nearly every entry until the 1970s. My grandfather's, his penmanship unmistakable, the same script that adorned the holiday cards, the land deeds, and suddenly his booming dinner voice took on a different tone in my memory, no longer proud or eccentric, but clinical, procedural, and I realized this wasn't a record of family. It was a system of selection, a generational method of filtering who belonged, who advanced, who was erased, and I found entire logs labeled disposition notes and alternative placement, and in one particularly aged ledger, I found the entry that made my skin crawl with final understanding. RT, excess temperament, removed, to bell rotation trial, and beneath it, barely legible, tower housed, not to be reintroduced, and I didn't recognize the initials at first, until I turned the page and found a list of furniture removed from RT's quarters, including a child-sized desk with a drawing pinned to it, labeled "To My Favorite Cousin," and the image, a stick figure beside another, holding hands beneath the bell tower, burned into my mind, and I remember the drawing, not from history, but from a long-forgotten afternoon in the summer sun, when I was 6 and a cousin I never saw again gave me a folded piece of paper and said, "Don't lose this, okay?" And I hadn't lost it, not really. It had just been absorbed into the fog of my memory until now, and I tore through the next series of ledgers with shaking hands, tracing every marked child, every mysteriously vanished aunt or cousin or sibling, and they were all there, listed clinically as removed, relocated, adjusted. And I felt a rising sickness, as I realized none of them had been sent away. They had been hidden, dissolved into the silence of this house, this tower, this name we all bore with false pride, and each notation, each bell rotation entry was not just a lie. It was a death sentence, or worse, a method of forgetting so complete that even mourning had been denied, and I began to whisper their initials aloud, one by one, the way one might pray, and the tower seemed to listen, its air growing heavier with every name I resurrected, and I found my own, too, eventually listed with no tier, no adjustment, just a note, monitor, tendency toward emotional discretion, possible inheritor, and I dropped the book, hands numb, because it wasn't chance that I survived, that I thrived, that I inherited a manor. It was by design, selected by a system I hadn't even known existed, shaped by people who watched my behavior like gardeners pruning a vine, and now I understood the full horror. I wasn't a detective here. I was a result, the end point of a process that stretched back generations, and the silence I had carried all these years wasn't mine, it was assigned, And with that realization came a fury, so cold and deep I felt my teeth clench hard enough to ache, and I gathered the ledgers, stacking them in the center of the room like bricks of testimony, and I whispered, "No more." And somewhere above, something shifted, a sound like tension loosening the rafters, and I knew that I wasn't alone in the tower, not in the supernatural sense, but an emotional one, surrounded by the weight of what had been lost and what now demanded to be seen. The first night I heard the footsteps, I thought they were mine, echoes bouncing off the stone, confused by the curve of the spiral stair and the high ceiling. But then I stopped, held my breath, and they didn't. They kept moving, slow and deliberate, each one a fraction, offbeat from my own rhythm, and they came from below, not above, as if someone had entered after me, or worse, had always been there, moving in circles like some phantom caretaker of the tower's long-buried secrets. And I froze, hand against the cold stone, pulse thudding like a drum inside my ears, and I whispered, "Hello?" Not because I expected an answer, but because silence had become unbearable, and the air didn't shift, didn't carry breath or rustle, but the steps stopped, paused as if, listening, and then resumed, closer now, softer, like bare feet on stone, and I backed upward instinctively, one hand braced on a railing, the other still holding the old ledger I had refused to put down. And as I climbed, the stone grew slick with condensation, the air thinner, and the idea that I might be hallucinating, sleep-deprived, emotionally overwhelmed, comforted me more than the alternative, because if the footsteps were real, then I was not the only one with a key, not the only one, willing to enter this vertical tomb. And at the landing I turned, stared down into the spiral darkness, and saw nothing. But the sound was still there, one slow step after another, until it stopped entirely, and I waited, trembling, mouth dry, for the next sound, but none came, only the rush of my own blood in my ears. And I made my way into the ledger room, and locked the door behind me with a latch that looked ornamental, but clicked with finality that said it had been used before. And I didn't sleep that night, not really, just rested my head on the desk, listening, until sometime past 3 when I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of humming, soft, slow, familiar in a way I couldn't name, and it was coming from inside the room, not outside, not through the walls, but here, right beside me, and I jolted upright, heart hammering, but the room was still, the ledgers unmoved, the lamp flickering low, and I told myself it had been a dream, a fragment of an old lullaby woven into nightmare. And yet, when I leaned forward, the desk bore a single new mark, etched into the wood where my head had rested. A spiral, shallow but precise, the kind I used to doodle absent-mindedly on napkins as a child. And that's when the memories began to twist, not in shape but in certainty. I recalled birthday cake, age 6, with candles shaped like bells, but in the photo I now found in the archive, there were no candles at all, only an empty cake and my mother's face, turned slightly away, her smile small closed, and I remembered my cousin Aurelia reading to me in the garden, her voice musical and steady. But now when I played the cassette, I found labeled Garden 98. It was only wind, static, and a faint whisper of my own voice saying, "Where'd she go?" And I began to doubt myself, to fear that maybe I hadn't remembered wrongly, but had remembered what I was allowed to, curated like everything else in this family. And the spiral staircase, the way it turned counterclockwise, began to feel symbolic, like a winding back of history. And each time I climbed or descended, I heard new things, rustling behind stone, a cough, the creak of a distant rope. And one night, when I crept down barefoot, breath held like a thread, I saw a shadow at the base, framed in moonlight from the window, a figure that moved like someone very old or very tired. And when I reached the bottom, it was gone, but a single page had been torn from one of the ledgers and laid. Across the first step, a birth certificate with my name, but the mother's signature wasn't my mother's. It was a different name entirely, and I stumbled back, hit the wall, slid to the floor, because either someone had forged this long ago, or someone had left it for me now, and both options gutted me, and I began to cry, not for myself, but for the truth I had been built around, for the version of me that had never been allowed to exist, and I whispered, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" And the only answer was a slow return of footsteps, soft as memory, walking away. The stairs narrowed near the top, stone-worn by time, and footsteps I could no longer pretend were just mine, and with each step the air thinned, not from height, but from density, as if every inch higher into the tower brought me closer to a truth that had been compacted into the walls, pressed like flowers between pages for someone like me to eventually find. And when I reached the final step, I stopped, not because I was afraid, though I was deeply, but because I sensed the threshold was real, that passing into the chamber above wasn't just about location. It was about acknowledgement, and I pressed my palm flat against the wood and let it feel the sweat there, the pulse, the quiet apology in my breath, and then I pushed, and the door swung open with no resistance, as if the room had been waiting all this time for someone to remember. And what I saw inside didn't make me scream, didn't break me with horror. It broke me with familiarity, because this was not an attic, not a storage loft, not a prison. It was a child's room, tucked beneath beams, sloped ceilings low, and the light from a single arched window illuminating dusk caught in time. And there was a small bed with iron posts, its mattress hollowed, as if someone had slept there for many nights, and then simply stopped, and on the bed was a worn coat, far too small for any of the adults who had ever lived here, and beside it a pair of shoes, child-sized, laced loosely, and on the floor lay scattered papers, drawings done in crayon, rough depictions of the manor, the tower, the bell, and one picture labeled me before, with a figure smiling and another me now, with the same figure behind bars, and I dropped to my knees, hands shaking, because this was an archival, wasn't historical. This was personal, immediate, and devastating, and I crawled toward the corner where a small box sat beneath the window, and inside were letters, unmailed, folded and worn, addressed to names I didn't recognize, names that didn't match any family tree I'd ever been shown, and every letter ended the same way. Please tell them I was here. Please don't forget me. And I realized then, with a kind of nausea that had no cure, that someone, some child, some cousin or sibling erased from every record, had lived in this room after being declared unviable or excess in the ledgers, hidden away not out of kindness but shame, preserved like a mistake no one wanted to throw out. And I whispered, "Who were you?" But I already knew it didn't matter, not in the way names usually do, because what mattered was the presence, the life lived in silence, the evidence that someone had once existed fully and been slowly dimmed until they vanished, and I stood and turned in a slow circle, taking in every detail. The pencil marks on the beam tracking someone's height, the feather pressed into a book like a keepsake, the plate still bearing the stains of a final uneaten meal, and I knew with sick certainty that this child had not been taken away, had not been rotated or sent to boarding school. They had been stored, like a family secret too loud to silence but too shameful to speak of, and the bell above, now just feet away, loomed above like a ceiling, a mute witness to years of quiet despair, and I climbed the final rungs of the ladder that led into its hollow core and reached the chamber, and there it was, the bell massive, matte with age, its clapper wrapped in thick cloth, tied tight with wire, a literal gag, and I stood inside it, light filtering through its lip like stained glass, and felt a chill so deep it numbed me, and I pressed my hand to the cool metal and whispered, "You heard it all, didn't you?" And the silence in response was louder than any toll could have been, and I knew then what had to come next, not because it would fix anything, not because it would undo the harm, but because if I left this room without sounding it, without marking that someone had lived and died and mattered in this space, then I was no better than the ones who came before me. And I felt something inside me break, not a snap, but an uncoiling, a loosening of all the tightly wound disbelief I carried since I arrived, and I whispered, "I see you," and the dust shifted in the light, and the air grew still, and I climbed back down into the child's room and sat on the bed and wept, not for them, though I did deeply, but also for myself, for the innocence I clung to like a shield, and for the fact that some truths only come once you're high enough to see how low everything has sunk. IT wasn't grand, not the way I'd imagined in those feverish nights of sorting ledgers and tracing initials, not a moment drenched in lightning or fire, but something quieter, something terribly still, like the moment before confession, the kind of stillness that lets you hear the shape of your breath. And I stood in the tower's core beneath the belly of the muted bell, its shadow stretching long across the planks, and I unwrapped the cloth from the clapper with slow, deliberate fingers, the fabric stiff from years of dust and tension, and with every unravel I felt the room grow denser, as if the act of revealing had weight, and when the last loop of wire came free and the cloth dropped to the floor like a discarded lie, I saw the brass heart of the bell exposed, dull with time but ready, and I thought, this isn't justice, it's acknowledgement, and my hands trembled as I reached for the rope, thick and stiff like an old scar, and I hesitated, not from fear, but from reverence, because this was not just a bell, not anymore. It was a voice of every child written out of family history, every cousin sent away and never spoken of, every scream swallowed into polite dinner conversation, every boarding school that was really just a sealed room, every smile that masked compliance, and every quiet night when the tower stood watch and said nothing, and I whispered, "This is for all of you," and pulled, and for a second there was nothing, just a sound of rope sliding, and then the bell rang, once, deep and wide, a sound so vast it seemed to shake the stones themselves, and it rolled out of the tower like a wave, not shattering but cleansing, and the house exhaled, literally exhaled. The doors groaned, the windows trembled, and the very air changed, as though everything that had been held tight for generations finally found room to stretch. And I stood with the rope in my hands and felt tears pour down my face, not delicate but raw, and I sobbed, as the echo faded, because the bell's voice was not angry, not cruel, but mournful, like a mother calling the names of children she cannot find. And I collapsed on my knees and wept in the floorboards, whispering name after name from the ledgers, every single one. And the room seemed to hold me, not an embrace, but an acknowledgement. And when I finally stood again, the dust had settled differently, lighter, freer, and I opened a small window beside the bell and looked out over the manor grounds, and everything looked the same, but I knew it wasn't, because the silence had changed. It had been broken, not shattered, but pierced just enough to let the light in, and I climbed down the ladder with legs that didn't feel like mine and stood in the small child's room once more, and I whispered, "You heard it too, didn't you?" And though there was no reply, the air felt less lonely, and when I opened the door to the stairwell, the light followed me down, and every step felt lighter, every creak less like a warning and more like a song, and I knew, absolutely knew, that the bell had not just rung for the past, but for the present for me, for the version of me that had returned broken and uncertain, and now stood with proof, not just of what happened, but of who I was in the face of it. And I whispered, "You're free now," not just to the ones I'd uncovered, but to myself. And as I descended the final stair and stepped into the hall, I didn't look up, didn't listen for echoes, because I didn't need to. The bell had finally spoken, and its sound would never leave me. The sound of the bell hadn't just reached the tower. It had rippled outward, down the halls, into the walls, into every locked drawer and hidden alcove of Vexley Manor, and I knew, as I made my way through the house with the dust of forgotten children still on my sleeves, that someone else had heard it too, someone who would be waiting, not surprised but summoned. And I found her in the morning room, where the sun lit the dust like fog and the teacups still bore the faint outlines of last night's gathering. A table set, but for whom? And there she sat, Aunt Meredith, the last of my mother's sisters, upright in a chair too stiff for comfort, her hands folded in her lap, like she had known I would come and had rehearsed her stillness for this moment. And when I entered, she didn't look up, just said, "You shouldn't have rung it." Not with anger, but with a kind of weary devastation that made me pause, and I stepped forward, heart pounding, and said, "Then why did you leave me the key?" And her eyes met mine for the first time, sharp but sunken, and she whispered, "Because I couldn't carry it any more." And suddenly the weight of it all felt heavier, as if the ledgers and the tower and the ghost of the unspoken had clung to her skin for decades. And I sat across from her and laid one of the ledgers between us, open to a page that simply read, Aurelia V., reassigned without notation. And she flinched just slightly, as if the name still carried voltage, and I asked, "Where was she reassigned to Meredith? What did that even mean?" And for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer, but then she looked out the window, eyes clouded, and said, "It means she cried too loud at night. It means she asked too many questions. It means your grandfather believed that silence was a foundation of legacy, and anyone who disrupted that silence was corrected." And she blinked slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek without drama, and I pressed further. "So you knew? All of you? All these years?" And she nodded once, like a condemned woman accepting her sentence, and said, "Not all. We knew pieces. Enough to stay quiet. Enough to be afraid. And I felt something twist inside me, a scream that couldn't find air, and I hissed, 'You let it happen. You let them disappear.' And her voice cracked. Not defensive, but hollow, and she said, 'I let myself believe there was a reason, that it was for the family, that it would stop,' and I could have struck her, could have walked away, but instead I opened the letter my mother had written, the one that bore only the phrase, "The chime is yours to choose," and slid it across the table, and Meredith stared at it like it was a ghost and whispered, "She wrote that after Aurelia." She begged him to stop, but she still kept quiet when you were born. We all did. We always did. And I asked the one question that had burned since the ledger room. Why me? Why was I spared? And Meredith looked at me then with a sadness so deep it seemed bottomless and said, "Because you were quiet. You never asked. You followed the rituals. You were perfect." And the word stung more than any insult, because I understood now that survival in this family wasn't about luck. It was about conformity, about shrinking into the silence until you were invisible. And I stood chest tight and said, "I wasn't perfect. I was obedient." And she nodded slowly and said, "We all were." And I turned, walked toward the door, and paused. "You could have stopped him." And she didn't reply, and I didn't wait, because I knew now that waiting was how they won, how silence became legacy. And as I stepped back in the hall and the sound of the house greeted me, creaks, distant clocks, nothing loud, I realized the chime hadn't ended anything. It had begun something, a reckoning, not just for the ones who had vanished, but for the ones who had survived by not looking up. And I would look up now. Always, I waited until dusk, when the sky bruised purple and the manor cast longer shadows in the trees. And I stood at the base of the tower where it all began, where the first lie was built into stone and allowed to echo downward through generations. And I called him, not by title, not by name, but simply, "Come down." And I knew he would, because he had been waiting just like I had, circling this place like a warden who didn't need chains to keep his prisoners, just guilt, just inheritance. And sure enough, the back door creaked open and out he stepped. Thomas Vexley, my uncle, my godfather, the quiet patriarch who had never raised his voice and yet managed to control every conversation, every estate decision, every narrative handed to me as a child. And he didn't say anything as he approached, his steps as precise as ever, his expression unreadable. But there was a tiredness in his posture, a looseness to his shoulders that wasn't there before, and we stood beneath the tower like figures on a chessboard, me in defiance, him in resignation. And I said, "You kept it going, even after grandfather, even after everyone else was gone." And he looked at the stone base, at the rope hanging limp from the narrow slit above, and replied, "Because someone had to." And the simplicity of that sentence made me want to scream, because it was so devoid of feeling, so full of hollow duty. And I stepped forward, voice trembling. "You don't get to say that like it was noble. You buried people. You decided who got to exist." And he nodded slowly, like he'd expected the accusation, and murmured, "You think I wanted this? That I asked for it? This family was already built when I was born." The silence was older than both of us, and I nearly laughed, bitter and sharp. "So you just followed the script? Just kept pushing children into closets and pretending it was preservation?" And for the first time I saw him crack, not with anger, but with something worse, honesty. And he said, "I tried to stop it once, when your cousin Claire began to ask questions. I went to your grandfather. I begged him to let her go to school. He told me silence is the cost of order, that one disruption can bring down the whole structure." And I stepped closer, heart hammering. "So you chose structure." And he whispered, "I chose survival." And I nearly choked. "For who?" And he finally looked me in the eye and said, "For you." And that broke something, because in his mind, in the warped logic of Vexley heritage, keeping me unknowing was love, was protection. And I spat, "You kept my life small. You stole my family." And he nodded, "Yes, I did. And now you're here to unmake it." And we stood there, both knowing what came next. And I reached into my coat and pulled the final ledger, the one labeled last year assignments, and held it out to him. And he took it with shaking hands and said, "If you open this, if you publish it, it will destroy everything." And I whispered, "No, it will explain everything." And he closed his eyes, breathed deep, and handed it back. "Then do it." And that was the end, not with violence, not with blood, but with a quiet yielding, a man stepping down from the throne of silence he never wanted to build. And as he turned and walked back toward the house, smaller somehow in the fading light, I stood alone beneath the tower and felt, for the first time, free, not because justice had been served, but because the silence had been broken. And when I looked up at the stone walls and heard nothing, I smiled, because that silence was mine now, not theirs. The house did not change overnight. Its windows still stare with that blank expression. The halls still whisper when I walked alone, and the tower still casts its long, cold shadow across the lawn. But I changed, and that was enough, because for the first time since I'd taken my first breath inside this place, I understood the language it spoke. Not words, not screams, but omissions, hesitations, the choreography of grief too disciplined to collapse into sorrow. And I stayed on for weeks after that final confrontation, cataloging every ledger, photographing each document, scanning drawings, collecting the names that had never been allowed to linger on anyone's tongue. And I created a book, part memoir, part record, a document that did not explain away what happened, but laid it bare in its most painful form, a legacy chosen, not inherited, built on fear disguised as tradition. And when I sent it to every living Vexley descendant I could find, I didn't include a note, because if they already know, they didn't deserve a gentle introduction, and the reactions were scattered. Some called it betrayal, others wrote long letters of apology or silence, and I didn't respond to any of them, because it wasn't for them. It was for the ones who had no voice left, and when the first journalist called, asking for an interview, I hesitated. But then I said yes, because the truth must be louder than the silence that kept it buried. And in the months that followed, as pieces of story surfaced in articles and podcasts and family archives, I returned to the tower one last time, not to climb it, but to stand beneath it and listen, and what I heard was nothing, and that nothing felt different now, no longer oppressive or ominous, but like the pause between breaths, the space before a new sentence begins. And I walked the grounds, tracing the paths where we once played, where laughter had once echoed to quietly, and I saw them all again. Aurelia, Lionel, the child who drew spirals and left them folded in forgotten drawers. And I whispered each name aloud, letting the wind carry them past the hedges and into the fields where they belonged. And I thought, this is what legacy should be, not silence, but echo, not repression, but resonance. And as I packed my things and left the manor for the last time, I looked back once, just once, and imagined the bell ringing. Again, they said the bell at Vexley Manor was just for show, never to ring, never to wake the past. But I was born in a house that built that silence, and I was the one who broke it. I hadn't driven past Vexley Manor in 15 years, not since the day I fled with a duffel bag full of textbooks and a heart that couldn't sleep under that same slate roof. But when the letter arrived, cream-colored, edges faintly charred, bearing only the words, "We await you," in an elegant black script, I felt the old pull, the ache inside my ribcage that told me I belonged to this place, even if I'd never wanted it. And so I rented a black sedan I barely recognized without manual windows, crossed the wheat fields and pines, and came to the long lane flanked by iron posts engraved with a family crest, a tower topped by a silent bell, unstruck for as long as anyone could remember. And I stopped the car at the foot of the drive, inhaling the scent of wet earth and moss and something else, something metallic and old, as though the land itself was mixing memory with grief, forging an atmosphere that curled my spine. And I realized I was holding my breath, trying not to inhale the legacy this place had slapped on every generation before me. And my hands went cold and slick as I killed the engine and stepped out, the tires hissing the dewy grass, eyes locked on the looming structure ahead, its windows dark, its walls still and closed, but louder in their presence than anything I'd ever heard. And as I straightened the envelope in my pocket, I thought I had prepared, emotionally, mentally, for this. I had rehearsed words I'd never say, loaded my past with distance and rationality. But the manor stood against me like a real thing with weight and dimension, not an idea or memory, and I felt small again, a child hiding behind a trunk while the grown-ups whispered lofty words I wasn't allowed to understand. And I wondered if I had changed, or the house had, or if home and prison were sometimes the same place, just polished different. I swallowed, pocketed the letter, and pushed the gate open. It squealed like an alarm I'd long ignored, and the gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked up the steps, each one echoing in the empty hall like a beat in a forgotten song. And when I reached the foyer, its chandeliers coated in dust, portraits lined along the walls showing stern faces in lace and velvet, eyes glinting with secrets, I realized that every surface was coated in memory, and that memory had no allegiance to comfort. It whispered at me, "You know what happened here," and I placed my hand on the banister, worn smooth by generations of palms, and felt that old familiar quiver, excitement, thrill, dread, and all at once the door behind me swung shut with a whisper hinge and doused any sunlight that made it through the dusty windows. and my breath lurched because I hadn't closed it, and I hadn't come back to play make-believe, but to unearth what I had spent my life running from, without knowing that I was running towards something, too. The bell tower. I had climbed that tower when I was 12, and felt my bones shake in ascent. Brick vaults, spiral stone stairs, echoing emptiness, and at the top it felt like being inside the mouth of a beast that didn't want to consume sound so much as swallow whole to silence grief, to keep us all small. But I couldn't remember where I paused or why I abandoned my friends on a landing shouting for me to come on. And I wondered if I had ever truly been up there or if it was all a dream. Now, standing in the center of the hall, with the letter warm in my hand, I felt the floors shift, the walls breathe, an awareness, not a haunting, but an accusation. You left. And I closed my eyes and heard memories echo. My grandfather's deep voice booming at Christmas dinner. The bell shall not toll on Vexley soil. And the hush that followed, as though the family breathed collectively, relief, and my mother's thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. And I remember the day my older brother disappeared. Disappeared in the middle of the summer luncheon out on the lawn, everyone distracted by the horse's tether for show, not noticing until his chair sat empty, the napkin folded just so. They said he wandered off and returned home shortly after, but years later they stopped telling that part, and I stopped asking, and I began to understand now that silence had been forced upon us, softly, insistently, like mildew, and that the bell tower, silent and stubborn, had kept its wind locked, its purpose unfulfilled, just as we had. I pressed my hand on the nearest portrait and realized I remembered that face without knowing it, my uncle, or someone who looked like him, in sailor's uniform, staring past the painter's brush into nothing, and the sense that his eyes followed me, asking, "Why did you come back?" And in that moment I recognized that the letter hadn't been mailed by anyone with love or kindness. It carried invitation and indictment both, and I realized that the Vexley blood in my veins didn't just win me birthright. It bound me to expectation, to duty, and maybe to guilt too, and tearing my gaze from the portrait. I stepped deeper into the manor, each step echoing like an unanswered question. Each door closed against me like a throat cut with courtesy, and I knew what I had to do. I had to climb that tower again, ring the damn bell, and in doing so, I would pierce the silence his family had built like a fortress. I exhaled, stepped into the dim light cast from a dusty chandelier, and promised myself I would not leave this place until the bell had sounded its first chord in a century, because some stones are laid to hide truths, and some walls are built to hold back screams. And as I let my resolve settle in my bones, I realized I wasn't just walking on a path back to the manor. I was walking down memory's spiral, and at the top awaited the sound I'd spent my life fearing and forgetting, the bell that was never meant to sound until now. They told us the bell had never rung in our lifetime, that its silence was a blessing, a gift passed down like fine china or the family name, something delicate and unspoken that we were expected to preserve without question. And as a child, I didn't ask why a bell was built to never toll, didn't wonder why a tower so tall, so regal, was crowned with mouth that would never open, not until years later when silence began to feel like a weight instead of a rule, when its presence became a figure that stood at every holiday, every family dinner, between every hug, soft and watchful and full of quiet condemnation. But back then it was just part of the house, just another shape in the sky, and I used to run beneath its shadow during those long summer days when the gardens were trimmed too perfectly and the hedges cast curious shapes, and I would press my palms to the stone foundation and imagine what lived inside. Not people, not really, but time coiled and waiting, and it never occurred to me that it wasn't waiting to be rung, but waiting to be kept silent. And there were rules, of course, always rules.